should we always be asking evaluate questions? Or should we always be asking create questions? It really depends on where we're at in the learning and on where the learner is at. Is there a type of question that's appropriate for a certain type of learner? Not necessarily. Everyone's on an individual learning journey. The question is, what's the next step in the learning for that learner? One key thing I'd like for you to have the capacity to do is to fluidly move around through blooms in your questioning. And to understand that when you ask a question at the higher level of blooms, automatically incorporated into it are all of the other levels. So I want to give you an example of how, when I walk into a classroom sometimes to see, kind of what's happening for questioning, I'll often see questions that are like this question. So, what were the 3 things we discussed yesterday? Kind of I'll see, quite often, not necessarily in this school, but quite often in schools, I'll see this as kind of the beginning. We're connecting to the students. All right, what did we talk about yesterday? What were those 3 things? Now, put yourself in the kind of a child's mindset for a moment. And what if you remember those 3 things from yesterday? Or what if you're potentially even offended that you'd be asking me, what are the 3 things I remembered? Because I can remember 3 things, we talked about them for an hour. Potentially, right? So what's the potential impact for connecting with relevance to the learner with this? If you're the kind of learner that knows very well what we discussed yesterday, you could just be disconnecting from this, and then once they're gone, they're really tough to get back. Now, imagine then if instead we ask this question. So can you explain the 3 things we discussed yesterday? This is a completely different question. And if you happen to be the learner that remembered those 3 things, maybe you're listening now with one ear to see, well, what are other people saying in relation to it? Maybe, if this was the first question, how would you use the 3 things we discussed yesterday? That is a completely different level of a question, and it's very difficult for people to disengage from it. Now, as we continue to move up blooms here at the analysis level, how do you use the 3 things we discussed yesterday? Or at the evaluate level, you might be looking at this question. So which of the 3 things we discussed yesterday is the more important one? Or at the evaluate level, or create level, you might be asking, how can you use the 3 things we discussed yesterday for the betterment of all beings? Now, which question do you want to ask with learners? Which is going to be more interesting? We're taught to meet the learners where they're at and to check for understanding. That's like a comment you always hear, check for understanding. But meeting the learners where they're at doesn't mean let's start at the bottom and see, okay, do you remember what they were? Okay, can you explain them to me? Meet the learners where they're at can mean completely the opposite. For me, I like to start at the top of blooms or very high up with my questioning. And then I will move down blooms until I find the learners where they're at. If you look at these questions and you imagine them as a scaffold working down, you will be showing students how to think critically. So if we just start at the evaluate question, so which of the 3 things we discussed yesterday is most important? If you don't get an answer, to help them to understand which of those 3 things is most important, then you might say, okay, well, how do the 3 things we discussed yesterday differ? Because if I can figure out how they differ, I might be able to determine which one's most important. I don't have an answer to that? Great, well, let's go. Well, so how would you use the 3 things we discussed yesterday? So if I know how we might use those 3 things, then I'm going to have some idea how they're different, which is going to help me to understand which is the most important. If I'm not sure how I would use those 3 things, then the next logical question is, well, can you explain the 3 things we discussed yesterday? If we still don't get an answer to that, then we need to go to, okay, what were the 3 things we discussed yesterday? Moving down blooms keeps your conversations at a very, very high level in your classroom. The most important thing is when you do connect with the learners where they're at, if it's at the apply or if it's at the understand level, then move back up again. And now you're teaching them a very, very high level of critical thinking by moving down and up blooms. And you're also showing them the level of thinking you expected in this school and what they're capable of. So I really want us to have a little go at taking the very same question on the very same topic and building it out against different levels of blooms. This can be done, and we do this to build our own muscles and our reflexes with being able to be nimble and moving around blooms. This can be done in any content area. So this picture is using Arabic grammar lesson. So people, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, in a world language, we're working on remembering. Well, just because we're working on remembering doesn't mean that we can't be having the provocation at a very, very high level. So this is working that bit of grammar against different levels of blooms.